Thoughts. A brief caveat about the title here. So best case scenario, I think we can all agree that we're not in the best case scenario. But what I posit in this brief is that the budget that came out, the President's budget for the Defense Department that came out last week, really it's an expression of what is the best that the Pentagon could do. And there are so many things that could go wrong. And there are so many different budgets embedded within this budget, something that's been echoed by senior officials such as Christine Fox, that even the hollowing out of the military we're seeing at the top line is really the best case scenario. Next slide, please. Okay, so some of you may have gone, there's been a lot of conversation on the Hill these days about the defense budget, about the QDR, and the extent to which they relate. We'll talk a little bit about that during this brief. So something, just a big top overline assessment. Funding is continued for the Special Operations Forces, select aircraft, missiles, and cyber and space capabilities. What essentially we're seeing is a reduction in readiness and a reduction in troop numbers, i.e. a reduction in current capabilities for future capabilities. As I mentioned, and mostly these reduction in troop numbers will be coming from the Army and the Marines. Now, this is going to be a theme of the brief, but I'll just bring it up in the beginning. These forecasts rely on very optimistic savings and spending forecasts. Now, these are optimistic not only in terms of things that Congress would need to approve, such as TRICARE reforms and another BRAC, which, from what I understand, is pretty much dead on arrival here on the Hill. But it also assumes that efficiency gains can be made within the Pentagon's budget, and also the budget exceeds sequestration by $115 billion between FY16 and 19, and it's not entirely clear where that money is being spent. We'll get into that a little bit more later, but suffice it to say that these are very optimistic outlooks contained within this budget. As I hinted at earlier, neither the budget nor the QDR are related as much as one might expect. The FY 2015 budget actually funds troop levels at 2019 sequestration levels, according to a footnote in Comptroller Hale's speeches. And it's really unclear how DoD would therefore fund the force outlined in the QDR. Now, we'll go through a lot of this in just a minute, but suffice to say, this is the best case scenario. Next slide, please. Okay, so just a brief overview of top-line trends here. The top line reflects the President's 2014 budget, the white line reflects the President's 2015 budget, and then sequester-level budgets are the black line. Now, the dashed white line reflects the Opportunity Growth and Security Initiative that the President has put forth that wouldn't require congressional approval. Essentially, what this does is it provides extra money for modernization, infrastructure, and readiness that wouldn't otherwise be provided for within the base budget. The budget that was submitted basically funds at about, it's a bit, give or take about maybe about $3 or $4 million, which is actually, it's peanuts when it comes to these large budgets, but pretty much in line with those 496 numbers without the OGSI funding. Of course, the 2015 budget is a little bit lower than the 2014 budget was, reflecting the President reacting to continued reality on the Hill and negotiating. But of course, it still doesn't fund what we would consider at AI to be a lot of our central defense priorities. But it is better than sequester-level budgets. We'll come back to this slide a little bit later. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's just go through really quickly, department by department, and look at what this budget does and does not fund. So of course there are going to be winners and losers in any budgetary decision. In this case, winners include Army aircraft procurement, things like Black Hawks, Army Special Forces units. In fact, Special Forces were winners, as may not be a surprise to this audience, but they were winners pretty much across the board. They're a very central part of the President's security strategy. Also, leadership development programs and the Abrams and the M109 tanks will receive some modifications. In terms of losers, Patriot and Javelin missiles will not receive the upgrades that people wanted. Sorry about that technical.
I think okay is the order of the day.
All right, I'll just continue then while we're waiting to get this back online. All right, personnel. Personnel are really going to be hit quite significantly in the Department of the Army. A negative 20K this year. It's really still unclear how the administration plans to draw down forces that quickly, but they're projecting that they're going to have 20K less at the end of FY15 than they had in 2014, and minus 45,000 over 5 years, and that basically results in a reduction of 38 to 32 BCTs. Now, one thing you'll see throughout this scenario, or throughout this presentation, if we can just go back one. There, thanks. Something you'll see throughout this presentation is I'm using asterisks, and these are places where the administration, where the Defense Department has noted that sequestration funding, if sequestration stays in effect and the FY15 budget is not implemented and OGSI is not implemented and TRICARE reforms aren't implemented, in other words, all of these caveats, if all of these caveats don't come true, then we're probably going to see a reduction in the numbers that have an asterisk. So in the case of this, in case of personnel, we actually will see a reduction down to 420K active Army soldiers, 335 Guard, and 185 reservists. But it's unclear precisely how this would work. Again, the theme you'll keep hearing me say throughout this presentation is there's a lot of confusion between all of these numbers. Within the budget itself, there are several different submissions depending on different funding scenarios, but then senior officials seem confused about what exactly they're buying with some of those numbers, and we'll get into some evidence of that in a little bit. Next slide, please. All right, Department of the Navy and the U.S. Marine Corps fare a little bit better. The Marines do face a reduction down to 182K. It'll actually go down to 175 in the event of a sequestration-only scenario. However, we are preserving modification capability or modifications for submarines. We're continuing the Virginia-class SSN build and protecting the destroyer build, at least for now, unless sequestration numbers come into effect. And there's some question as to whether 11 carrier strike groups will remain operational. That's why there's the question mark, hence the question mark there. Technically, under the 2015 numbers, there is enough funding for the 11 carrier strike groups. However, given some of the discrepancies between public statements from the comptroller and some of the budget documents, it's unclear exactly how that 11th group will be funded, which means that the USS George Washington may not be able to be refueled when that cycle comes up in the next couple of years. Now, going down to some other losers, the Tomahawk cruise missile cruisers are going to be laid up until future upgrades. This kind of ties into that theme of mortgaging current capabilities for future capabilities. Hopefully at some point we'll find some money to update the cruisers, but for now they're going to be laid up until we can actually get them the necessary upgrades. And we'll also be reducing the LCS build. And the main takeaway from this is that these reductions essentially are going to reduce our capacity to respond to potential littoral crises in the short term, and really also in the long term until we find the money to do some of these upgrades or to get the amount of LCS that would actually match the mission that our Navy and that our Marines are asked to perform. Next slide, please. Mm-hmm.
Would you say that this is a new approach for DoD, saying they're only going to be laid up until future upgrades? Because this group of ships have always been on the cut list that the Navy has given them, where they wanted to mothball them rather than just lay them up.
Right. Well, it's definitely a better approach to lay them up than to mothball them. But I would say that given the way the security dynamics have been developing over the past 5 to 10 years, with increased potential for littoral combat, things like that, that this may not be the best choice in terms of what we should be doing with our cruisers. It's obviously better than scrapping them, but I would also say that actually going through and scrapping them would cost nearly as much as it would just to lay them up for the short term. So some of this really kind of depends on your priorities, but this is definitely going to cost in our ability to respond in the littoral environment. Okay, moving on to the Air Force. Winners include F-35. I don't know if this is, can you all hear me? Okay. Winners include F-35As, KC-46s, though the buy rate will go down in a sequestration-only scenario. Also, modifications of fighters and bombers, and the Global Hawk is winning out over the U-2 manned spy plane, reflecting a trend towards more unmanned aerial systems, vice-manned aerial systems, particularly in the ISR environment. Missiles also are win. We're continuing on with the small diameter bombs and the ICBM Minuteman III upgrades. But the A-10s are being retired, which of course this is going to be this basically is going to be, they're viewed as redundant given the close air support that some other systems, such as the F-35, should be able to provide. But that, of course, will be threatened if the buy rate is not able to be kept where we have forecasted it, then that's not going to be the case. So that's a potential strategic vulnerability. And then also the Reaper procurement is reduced. So that's supposed to be offset by Global Hawk and other systems that are coming on board. But that is a very useful tactical asset that is probably going to be reduced here and may actually be reduced even further under sequestration.
Actually, an upgrade slide on the A-10
Yeah, the Air Force isn't a big fan of those, so. All right, next slide, defense-wide initiatives. Winners, as we mentioned earlier, special forces units, also cyber capabilities, though much of that funding is classified, but there is there's money in the budget to go towards increasing the amount of personnel working on cyber issues. Also space, missiles, and missile defense. The classified section of the budget, which mostly is funding some of these initiatives, expanded by a couple of percentage points given relative to the overall funding or the overall whole of the defense budget. So again, in the near term, there will be some capabilities we won't have, but in the long term, the Defense Department is planning on making up for that with some smart investments in space, missiles, and missile defense. The exact investments are a little bit unclear. Okay, losers, pay, and this is a big one. Some of the losers here under defense-wide initiatives are very optimistic and presumptive. So some of these, just from talking with colleagues, some of these are more realistic than others. For example, it's probably likely that a modest living allowance or housing allowance, excuse me, growth rate reduction can go through. But the TRICARE plan consolidation, the pay raise limits to flag officers, I mean, as I'm sure many of you know, these are things that, there are many advocacy groups here on the Hill that, and many constituencies that really don't want to see these things happen. And, a lot of these tend to be political third rails in a lot of ways. So a lot of people don't want to push these through. And I'd say the best example of that is the BRAC proposed for 2017. I should also note that would actually increase costs in the short run because it costs money to close down all of these facilities, though there may be some savings in the long run. Okay, next slide. So the question of the day is, can we trust these numbers? As I mentioned before, a lot of these are premised or predicated. A lot of these savings are predicated on optimistic initiatives coming, or an optimistic forecast of initiatives passing through Congress, such as BRAC and TRICARE. Another more important question is if these things don't go through, it's not clear where the Defense Department would recoup those savings or would make up the difference. So in other words, let's say the TRICARE consolidation doesn't pass, and that means that DoD is going to have to find some money to account for where it thought it was going to be saving. It's not clear exactly where they would whittle that money away. And then another interesting thing, of course, the Quadrennial Defense Review. A question?
Sorry to keep interrupting, but in the case of TRICARE consolidation, the delay of an offset is not entirely on DoD. As a disclaimer, I'm from one of those beneficiary associations that did work on this issue. But we basically sit down with representatives on the Armed Services committees and actively try and find an offset for the TRICARE savings that has been suggested. This is part of the DoD strategy to under budget things to purposely force Congress to bring about these reforms.
That's definitely one way of viewing some of these numbers, for sure. Actually, if you could, maybe we could talk afterwards. I don't know if it's the right time, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about some of the plans that you all have for offsets, because that's something that's a little bit less clear from like an outsider's perspective. All right, so looking at the Quadrennial Defense Review and trying to match whether the budget actually lines up with the QDR, it starts to become a little bit less clear. So a senior DoD official has said the 2015 budget does not contain money for extra troops or carriers, which kind of goes against some of the rhetoric that was coming out when the QDR, or that's in the QDR and also in the original budget documentation. Secretary Hill briefing quotes sequester level and end strength targets in the footnote for the PB-15 FIDIP, which is really interesting because if you look at the QDR, if you look at the budget, you would think that it's actually funding at a higher rate, but as it turns out, it looks like it's not. An interesting footnote, it seems that the authors of the QDR, though, did coordinate this. An interesting footnote on page 39 shows that some out-year force structure plans may change if Congress appropriates at the 5-year level in the President's budget request. So if you look at these things and you put all the pieces together, the conclusion is that the 15 budget doesn't fund the end strength at the levels quoted in the QDR, which brings the purpose of the QDR into question and presents a whole host of questions that congressional offices should be asking of people on the Hill. Are asking of people in defense. Next slide, please. Okay, so just to get a little bit more into the details about what we've seen here, and you guys have these slides, so, and if you want to talk a little bit about the numbers, we certainly can. But this is straight out of the QDR, out of budget documentation, and then out of the Defense Department document that outlined what the impact of the sequester would be. So if we look at the FY19, what I put in quotes as goal, hit next please. This is where the 2015 request does not fund. It actually funds at this level, and it funds for 10, not 11 carriers. So the question becomes then, what is that $115 billion that we'll be spending over the next 3 years? What is it actually going to? It's not clear. It's not going to a higher level. It's not going to a higher troop level. It's not going to more carriers. And it's also not clear if that money does not go through, what's going to fund even this level. So there's a lot of confusion going on with the numbers, and you can even see it in the way that the defense officials are talking in the media. There's a lot of kind of, well, yes, we recognize this, and we're trying to figure it out, and it was really quick. We had to throw this all together really fast, and just bear with us. But you know, if the American public doesn't have, if the defense officials don't have clarity on this, Congress certainly doesn't. The American people don't, and we can't make informed decisions. Next slide, please. There's also confusion here at the top line. Next, please. So this is that difference of $115 billion that you've heard me talk about and probably others. It's the area essentially between the white and the black line. Next, please. This is the money that we're not clear where it goes. Next. And even more money is going to be required beyond the president's budget in 15 to be able to achieve the end strength that's quoted. So, next slide, please. This just leaves a lot of questions. A lot of questions that could come up at congressional hearings, a lot of questions that you may want to ask your own representative, or if you're with a particular group that meets with Congress members, that you might want to bring up with them. Ask questions that clarify the situation, because there's a lot of confusion in the media and also on Capitol Hill about this. If they're confused about the budget, how are we, or the American public, those of us, and those of us who look at this every day are confused about it, how's the American public supposed to understand? Also, so if we can't trust the numbers between, or if there's a mismatch between the funded levels and between the number of troops we actually will get, then what is the necessary amount that DoD actually needs? Because clearly it's way above that $115 billion. They actually would need much more than that. But what is that magic number? It's really not entirely clear. Another mystery here is how unobligated balances are being used, and this is kind of arcane budget talk, but the Pentagon essentially has funds that are called unobligated balances that can be used kind of as padding and moved into different accounts, and it's not entirely clear how they're being used right now, how much longer they'll last, et cetera. And those are potentially sources of fundings that are a little bit more fungible than other sources, can move around a little bit more and could be useful. Also, just as detail questions. For example, what does this $115 billion fund, just at a fundamental level? And then also what the plans are, this gets to the sidebar we were having earlier, what the plans are if some of these reforms don't occur, what are the offsets? And detailed plans on that would be really interesting. Also, what does an actual sequestration scenario end strength look like? Because apparently if the president gets his way and the OGSI goes through, then we're funding at a level that was the sequestration forecast level. So if we don't have OGSI and sequestration goes through, then what does that actually look like? Clearly it's going to be worse than what we've already forecasted. And then at the very top line, just press for strategy. If this budget reflects the best case scenario, then what are the strategic implications of a worst case scenario? With that, I'll turn to your questions.
Thank you.
Budget, after looking at each budget, so there's so much uncertainty. And the thing is,
Absolutely.
When you present a budget, you're supposed to present numbers, but a lot of these numbers are based on variables that they say will be taken care of in the future. So I think this is a terrific document that you guys put out.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I mean, we're really confused. So, I mean, to the extent that you can actually get some clarity on this, we're going to try to as well. But we obviously need to hold our budget makers accountable. Otherwise, how are we supposed to plan for the future?
Phil, I noticed in a couple of slides back you had an asterisk next to the UAS saying that those platforms are most likely to be targeted during sequestration. I was struck by that, given this president's apparent inclination to lean pretty heavily on these platforms, particularly in the non-state actor environment, but also given that we're still, at least on paper, pursuing a pivot to Asia, and China, of course, is going all in on unmanned systems. What accounts for sort of the zeroing in on unmanned systems in the context of sequestration, especially in light of the fact that they're supposed to be pretty cost-effective, no?
Yeah, no, I agree. Generally, from what I could tell, it's mostly Predator and Reapers that are specifically singled out. And to be clear, some of the unmanned aerial systems are funded in the classified budget too, so I'd like to think there's balances going on in the classified side. But it's mostly Predators and Reapers. Things like the Global Hawk, the buy rate may go down, but it is protected. But you're absolutely right that there's even strategic confusion going on with some of these decisions, which indicate even a larger lack of clarity beneath the surface.
Part of this, though, is they want to upgrade to the next generation
Right.
UAS as well. So
Mike?
I said part of this is related to the fact they want to upgrade to the next generation of UASs, so they want to phase out the older ones to free up money for newer.
Yes, sir. Mike? Mike is right there. There we go.
I think one of the things that you mentioned, TRICARE, you've got three competing medical healthcare systems in the military. You have the Army Surgeon General, Navy Surgeon General, and Air Force Surgeon General, and they're at each other's throats, and it's costing billions of dollars. And then you've got the Military Health Agency that's constantly reorganizing, and trying to get this electronic health records straight. They try to set up a joint thing with the VA. That flopped and wasted millions of dollars. So I think and this would have to come from Congress, if you would consolidate the three separate military health care systems into one, that would bring you savings, and then it would certainly hopefully contribute to better care for the military personnel, which they so richly deserve. So.
Yeah, I agree. And actually, if you're interested in some of these reform proposals, just to put in a shameless plug for one of the booklets we passed out, my colleague Mackenzie's done a lot of work on this, and she outlined some of these ideas in the paper that we passed out.
Marshall?
Sorry to keep jumping in, but just to let you know, on the electronic health record, basically DOD and DHA have abandoned trying to do it independently, and they are now taking bids for off-the-shelf software, because, as they said, when they first started this project, they were ahead of the power curve to the commercial market, and then within the last 10 years, because of changes in medical insurance and things, the private industry has surpassed them, and they realize that it's going to be far cheaper to invest in things that are available commercially than trying to do it independently. Yeah. So a lot of millions, I should say, hopefully not billions, have been wasted on their early efforts, but they've changed direction.
I guess this is not altogether surprising, but it is more than a little troubling that the Defense Department doesn't seem to have a clue what it's doing on this front. And I can understand in particular that they've been jerked around pretty badly, and that jerking around is likely to continue, especially with the uncertainty of what's going to be done, if anything, on sequestration. I'm fond of saying, and I'm sure this has dawned on the rest of you as well, there isn't a business in the country that would voluntarily run the way we're making the most important business of the country run now year upon year. And the idea that this isn't going to have consequences is fantastic and folly. Can I just ask, Philip, in the last QDR exercise, as I recall, Steve Hadley, and I can't remember who was his counterpart, but there was an alternative QDR that was done, and I'm not quite sure whether that was officially mandated or it was a kind of pickup team, but is there any similar kind of, was it a congressional program?
Yeah, it was.
Something like that going on?
It was congressionally mandated. The current administration has not decided to do that this go around. However, there have been ad hoc efforts. For example, we had the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, where Todd Harrison is, they put together an exercise where those of us in the think tank community, many of whom participated in the independent panel, were able to come together and look at the numbers and come up with alternative ideas. Some of those ideas were briefed here on Capitol Hill. I'm definitely happy to pass some of those out. It was AEI, CSBA, also CNAS, and CSIS. It was interesting. We all kind of came up with similar ideas, though. I mean, not similar ideas to here, but there was a general consensus that when you look at the numbers, there's no way that readiness cannot be impacted in the long term. As much as we didn't want to have to do that, even under a half BCA scenario, readiness is going to be impacted. These force numbers are going to go down further than what the projections are, and there's going to be an unavoidable consequence to procurement as well.